and we'll get right to it. And the question is, because I didn't know else really how to pose this question, but can podcast, or essentially this question may be better, can kayfabe work in the podcast world? And I guess the way that we mean by this is Ric Flair's last match. It comes up next week. We've been talking about it. It's big and it's got lots of hype. But one thing it doesn't have that we're used to in the world of professional wrestling is AEW Dynamite, Monday Night Raw, SmackDown, all these traditional channels. Because what is wrestling without a story? It's nothing. I mean, that's kind of part of how wrestling works. So, this was going along without that story, without all those reasons of why anyone would be Ric Flair's last opponent, or really why anyone would be anybody's opponent on this card. But thanks in part to the most recent edition, if you will, I guess, in part of Jeff Jarrett's podcast, as well as some other things that have taken place outside.
And some other podcasts, too.
And some other podcasts.
Yeah. So let me preface it this way. So the whole adfreeshows.com network is run by Conrad Thompson, who they call him the Podfather because he's on like so many podcasts. But to preface it a little bit further, he's married to one of Ric's daughters. So like he has a very close relationship with Ric Flair, the Nature Boy. So on this past week's episode of My World with Jeff Jarrett, essentially they went into talking about, in the beginning of it was essentially part of the documentary, they were just kind of telling the story of why Ric Flair's doing this, and it's not our choice to tell him what to do. It's it's his choice. It's something he wants to do. So you can't tell somebody not to do something if they love it so much. If they can do it, let them do it. Now, getting into the whole podcast, this is where it gets interesting, because Jeff Jarrett and Conrad Thompson are in business together, because last time I checked, Ad Free Shows, they have a lot of business. They're doing different WrestleCons. They're doing all these like Top Guy Weekend things. So Jeff Jarrett and Conrad Thompson, they've been business partners for long enough. I think it's been over I want to say it's like a year and 4 months, year and a half, something like that. And the whole story kind of came down as Jeff Jarrett attacked Ric Flair.
Yes, yeah. There's a lot of little stories so obviously Jay Lethal was the one who helped Ric Flair, and this episode of the podcast, I feel like it really summed up. It was really like an edition of Monday Night Raw in a podcast, because it played a lot of the audio clips of some of the stuff that happened visually. It kind of caught me off guard a little bit, to be honest, when I was listening to the podcast, because the first 30 minutes of it is like all these replays of things in which I went back and watched on YouTube to put into better context, and then the podcast itself. And I guess my thing is, we are so used to podcasts nowadays in the world of wrestling, telling the quote unquote real story, shooting, if you will, and being the place in where people go to talk about wrestling outside of kayfabe. But in this instance, they're using a podcast format because they don't have television, they don't have Impact TV, they don't have any of that stuff to create the storyline for this match via a podcast and via other means. Jay Lethal was slighted. He was left off the card after being the one to
get Ric ready.
Get Ric ready for the match. And then Jeff Jarrett took slight during the media scrum press conference for this, that Ric Flair said, "Hey, I'll have 2 tickets for Jeff Jarrett and your dad. Yep. You can sit ringside or whatever. But, you're not going to be on the card," kind of thing. And that kind of spilled off. And yes, then it turned into Jeff Jarrett's personal podcast where, you can tell it's a lot of kayfabe. You can tell, what it reminds me of? It reminds me of that book. I don't know if you remember this book, but do you remember when WWE created the Kayfabe Kane book?
Yes.
They created, yes. And that was at a time we were so used to all of these books telling the real story. The Mankind book, the Rock book, the Stone Cold book, the Controversy Creates Cash, Eric Bischoff book. And then WWE created the story of Kane. But obviously we know Kane is not real. Glenn Jacobs is real. And it was essentially a biography of a fictional character. And that's what this is. It's a podcast telling the real story of a fake story.
Which I got to tell you.
And it's interesting and it's great because obviously there are things in which, and you wonder where in World of Wrestling,
it's
where you draw the line, because there are real elements.
You're going to see this done again. Not just not even through the ad-free shows, Conrad Thompson, that network. You're going to see it. You're going to see, the AEWs of the world. You're going to see WWEs of the world. You're going to see this duplicated many times over because Conrad Thompson's the guy. The guy knows what the hell he's doing. He obviously has the podcast business, but he's a hell of a real estate. He's in the mortgage business. The guy knows what the hell he's doing. He's got enough connections in the business to make this work. And here's the thing: you got Jim Crockett Promotions involved. I mean, he's the one guy that he's hard to get to show up to to events. It's like one of those things where it was like the big whale, so to speak, where it's like, all right, we can finally get him to show up to a show because I don't think he wanted to do it anymore. I think he just wanted to get away from the business. Is my interpretation of not only Jeff Jarrett's podcast but 83 Weeks this past week as well. And the thing I liked about how they did it was it was like Jeff Jarrett was like you said, he was telling the story from his perspective and what was in his mind, the right way of how they were like in his mind, he was doing everything the right way. Like Ric Flair slighted me, you're slighting me, Conrad, after all the stuff I've done for you in the state of Tennessee and primarily in the city of Nashville. It was just a cool back and forth, and I got to tell you, Conrad Thompson sold the hell out of that as well.
Yeah, it's different to hear. If you are somebody who listens to all the ad-free shows, or Something Wrestled with Bruce Pritchard, or you watch them on YouTube or however you consume them, it is a unique thing because Conrad Thompson, you're used to obviously being a moderator, obviously just being somebody in a podcast world like we are right now, talking wrestling in the outside of the ring perspective, talking to it in a realistic and a real outside of storyline way. But yet here you're Conrad Thompson, like, you son of a bitch. How dare, don't you're a scumbag, Jeff Jarrett. Like
it was
playing
great.
A character. Conrad Thompson, I don't know if this is the very first time ever, but he's playing a wrestling character for maybe the first time in his life.
I think he really is. And you can buy it because of the family ties. He's literally married to Rick's daughter. So he could play off, emotions that, in fact, if they were real, this is how he's reacting because he watched, quote unquote, watch Ric Flair get his ass beat. But in the same sense, obviously, it's all kayfabe. So essentially, I think the way he's doing it, which he's doing a hell of a job, is he's in the mindset of, oh, this is real, and Jeff Jarrett's a scumbag, and this and that. It is so interesting. And here's the other thing too, and coming from a business perspective, of course, me talking business, we've done that a lot over the years. I love the fact that they in the promotional spots that Conrad does those reads, he was like sliding Jeff Jarrett in the freaking reads. Like he was like literally he was doing ad reads for companies that paid for the time, and he's sliding Jeff Jarrett in the process. It is, to me, it's a very unique way of doing it, but it was so interesting. And I know the match, the card, the whole show is not till next week, but it was so interesting. It's so hot right now amongst all the podcast world that we talked about it, and we had to talk about it this week. It's just so good.
Yeah, because I think what helps too is it takes a lot of the interest off of Ric Flair in this match, in the sense of it's all about what is he doing, and it kind of adds a story to the match itself. And it takes, I guess, a lot of people are just looking at this, and I've been looking at the whole time of just like, what is Ric Flair doing? It's all about like the attention on him because he is old. He should have probably had his last match a long time ago. He's had a bunch of last matches, and it just kind of seemed like it reeked of desperation a little bit in this last match and having another match and doing this whole thing. So finally to have at least some sort of storyline to it, at least to have like an interest in why you'd want to watch the match from a wrestling perspective and not just what is he doing kind of perspective. Like,
and here's the thing too. And I remember I accurately predicted it to a point. I got partial credit for this.
That it was going to be a tag team.
Jay Lethal.
Yeah.
I did predict the Jay Lethal part of it. That was something
I think a lot of people were hoping a long time ago that it was going to be a tag team match. And for the most part, a lot of people then were thinking it wasn't going to be. But here at the last minute, about a week before the match.
And it's a good thing.
It's going to be a tag team match.
It's a good thing because essentially, who's going to carry the match is Andrade and Jay Lethal. I think we all know that. There's going to be enough spots for Double J, and there's obviously going to be enough spots for Ric Flair. And even Ric Flair was teasing that he's going to go to the top rope. So that's going to be a sight to see a 73-year-old guy going from the top rope to hit a crossbody, for example. That's going to be a sight to see. And I'll be honest with you, this has the chance, and the card is still being put together. but the latest card I've seen, it could be one of the best not even to say non AEW WWE shows, but just one of the best pure wrestling shows of the year.
Yeah, it's a pretty decent card. The whole SummerSlam weekend is very much reminiscent of a WrestleMania weekend outside of WWE essentially they're adding the SummerSlam part, but they're not adding their own elements in the sense of like the accesses and stuff that's being brought in by StarCast, which is doing all the fan conventions, doing all the meet and greets with their people, and then essentially putting on the Ric Flair match itself. It reminds me a little, if you're not kind of catching what we're talking about, think of Bite This, which was that internet show back in the day that was the real life kind of internet show episode, if you will, I think in like 2005, that talked about the Matt Hardy and Lita situation that turned into a wrestling match. But think about it from a perspective of if they kind of knew it going in. That was a shoot that turned into a work. This is a work the whole way, but they're using the shoot means, because podcasts are normally the shoot means. That's where you go to talk out of character, to say what you really mean and how things really went down.
Well, yeah, I mean,
so they're using that means to hype up this match.
Because you're like you said, and just to put a little cherry on it, it's typically with these podcasts, it's going behind the curtain. You're getting like the Eric Bischoff podcast. It's like going behind the scenes of, okay, what were you thinking when you booked this angle, or how did the NWO become?
This is
what
essentially
it is,
how the
like
Undertaker. If podcast existed in the 90s, this is how the Undertaker would have done podcasts.
Yeah, 100%. I mean,
or anybody really, Stone Cold for that matter. You know what I mean? They would have done podcasts. They would have been like, what's the real story between you and Vince McMahon? The real story is I hate his guts. I don't want to work for the, you know what I mean? And it would have been interesting. It would have been interesting back in the Attitude Era to have podcasts or these things where they're in character, but in a real realm, like a radio show or a podcast.
Did you also hear the tickets are they're hot? It's a hot ticket in Tennessee.
Well,
in Nashville.
They moved it to a bigger venue. It was originally sold out at a small venue. I don't think it's going to sell out. I don't think, because it's a pretty decent sized venue. It's at the Nashville Auditorium, formerly the main arena in Nashville, before they invented the Bridgestone Arena and put the NHL team in there.
Do you know what that seats?
About 9,000.
Oh, it's going to sell out.
Oh, you think so?
Yeah, I do. I mean, it's a hot ticket. And here's the thing. They're going to be jumping on the bandwagon of SummerSlam weekend.
I know. So. I mean, they definitely are doing that.
Because here's the thing. SummerSlam is Saturday.
Well, yes, obviously.
Right, and here's the thing. And
it's not
Sunday,
a coincidence it's in Nashville. No, none of this is a coincidence.
They're going to hitch their wagons to it. And I'm I don't know if you're going.
I'm not, and it's disappointing.
I was going to say, if you were going, I know what you would do. You would go to SummerSlam.
I would be going to all of it, yes.
You'd go to Rick, you go Monday Night Raw, and
unfortunately, I think WWE isn't adding that element. WWE, we've talked about this before, outside of WrestleMania, they haven't added that element for some reason that I don't know. Meaning that Money in the Bank, they weren't in Las Vegas for Monday Night Raw.
Which
and
is
they're
odd.
not going to be
Yeah,
in
which is
that.
odd.
I think they're going to be in Atlanta for Monday Night Raw.
Is it really that?
Yeah, and they're not even there for SmackDown either. They're just there for SummerSlam.
See, that makes sense.
They don't have like
that
they're not
model.
going to have like even like a SummerSlam access. They'll probably have a store or something of that nature.
See, I don't like the way WWE does it. That's
But it is like a WrestleMania weekend, because unlike last year's SummerSlam, which was just WWE and a few other small things, StarCast is coming in here and really amping up everything, because they're going to have tons of meet and greets. They're going to have the first podcast with Paige since her departure from WWE. They're going to have Mick Foley. They're going to have Bret Hart 30 years later, since he's going to be there live.
Mick Foley has
podcast.
signed a new contract with WWE too.
Yeah, so they're going to have a bunch of podcasts and stuff going on that whole weekend. It's going to be interesting to see Ric Flair's match, probably more so now than ever. And it, like you said, it'll be interesting to see going forward that if some people are going to use these means to hype up their matches, the podcast means to hype up matches.
Don't be surprised, because After the Bell is WWE's the number one podcast. Don't be surprised if you see something someday where Corey Graves, talks smack about Pat McAfee on his podcast, and then Pat McAfee talks smack about Corey Graves on Pat McAfee's show. You're going to see this stuff happening. It's just, Conrad Thompson is a visionary. I give him a lot of credit for that. So there's something there, and there's going to be something brewing here, because the podcast world is booming. Everybody has a podcast, and I think more people listen to podcasts than you have at your terrestrial radio stations these days. That's just a fact.
So I'll put this out on our Twitter account. Be on the look for it at Heel to the Face. The question is to you: can podcast be used for kayfabe? And don't forget, make sure after this video, you tune into some of our audio formats, because that's where we will wrap up this week's edition of the show and talk about so much more. But that is it for the Ric Flair topic. Can podcast be used for kayfabe? Will podcast be used for kayfabe in the future?